Hello, everyone. Welcome. My name is Isabel de la Paz. I am from the Philippines and I serve as a network facilitator for the Restoration Education Project at Craft. It's very wonderful to have everyone here today, and thank you so much for joining the fourth session of the GLF Asia Community and Action Digital Week, a digital gathering for deep and reflective conversations about Asia's communities, landscapes, and futures. This week is dedicated to critical reflection, collective hope, and care. And our shared goal is to imagine and forge pathways towards futures where safety and prosperity are rooted not in extraction or excess, but in the well being of all life on Earth. Today's session is titled Adaptation Strategies: What Holds Us Together When Everything Breaks. And for this conversation, we'll reflect on what adaptation really means in a region that is warming nearly twice as fast as the global average. And across Asia, climate impacts are already reshaping lives and landscapes. What we're seeing is that adaptation is political. Who has access to resources, whose knowledge is recognized, and whose voices shape decisions all influence who is able to adapt and who is left exposed. At the same time, frontline communities are responding with lived experience, local knowledge, and collective care, showing us that solidarity often emerges in moments of crisis. And in this session, we'll explore what holds communities together when systems fail, how collaboration and care take shape under pressure, and what it might look like to move beyond short term coping toward transformative approaches that address root causes and build long term equitable resilience. I'm really honored to be joined by two speakers who bring powerful, grounded perspectives to this conversation. We're joined by Ramiana Raman, or Ami, from Indonesia, chairperson of Rumah Relawan Remaja, a grassroots organization that hosts GLF X Aceh. Through her work, Ami regularly travels to remote villages across Aceh to encourage youth participation in peace education and environmental conservation. She's also deeply engaged in community libraries where her efforts extend beyond basic literacy to nurturing environmental awareness and a culture of care within communities. We also welcome Nina Sangma from India, an indigenous rights advocate belonging to the Garo indigenous community from Northeast India. She promotes and defends indigenous peoples' rights and human rights through the articulation of indigenous peoples' issues through public interest media. Her current focus is to create strategic space for Indigenous peoples in global and regional digital rights coalitions, where they can extend their advocacy and media campaigns through decolonial narratives, thereby attempting to narrow the digital divide that has excluded Indigenous peoples from meaningful representation and participation. Thank you all so much for the time to join us in this space and for the work that you do. Now, let's all dive into the conversation. For our first question, and this is addressed to both Ami and Nina, but perhaps we can start first with Ami. When the climate crisis stops becoming something that we see on our phones and more on something becoming part of our everyday lives, what forms of care, knowledge, or solidarity have you seen emerge first in your community or work, and why do they matter?
Yeah, it's an honor to share this space with you, Nina, and other audiences, especially for the conversation that feels so close to our life realities. So I want to respond to this question from live experiences in Aceh, where I think the climate crisis and disasters are no longer abstract. They are part of our everyday life: floods, coastal erosion, unpredictable seasons, and increasing pressure on livelihoods. What emerged first is care rooted in community relationship. When climate impacts occur, people do not wait for formal responses. That's seeing at the ground. Neighbors check on one another, share food, open the mosques, open their homes as temporary shelters, and they will prioritize children, elders, and people with disabilities. This is collective care which is shaped by long standing social bonds and shared sense of responsibility. And I think this strong sense of solidarity is also deeply influenced by Aceh's experience of the 2004 tsunami. The disaster left a lasting collective memory of loss, survival, and mutual dependence. So many people learned that survival depends not only on external aids, but on how community organize themselves and care, of course, for one another. The second form that is a local and lived knowledge. Farmers, fishers, and coastal communities um, like rely on environmental science in making daily decision. This knowledge is passed down through practice and oral traditions, and it plays a crucial role in participating to risk, even though it is often overlooked in formal planning. And last but not least, I think it is solidarity through informal networks, especially among young people. Across Aceh, youth-led volunteers groups mobilize quickly during floods and other climate-related events. They share information, organize fundraising, raise, uh, uh, finding logistics, and reach areas that are difficult for formal system to access. So at the same time, communities, yeah, I think this young people group strength lies in trust and collective motivation rather than formal authority.
Thank you so much for that, Ami. It's very
Mhm.
inspiring to hear how your community takes care of each other, and also how you no longer wait for formal responses, and how you really leverage on indigenous knowledge and informal networks to take care and look after each other. Thank you for that, Ami. And Nina, what do you think about this question?
I'm in agreement with what was said. For me, I think it's very important. One of the biggest challenges I think for indigenous peoples and communities, local communities, is that we're losing our collective memory, right? Our ways of doing, our ways of being. That's so interconnected to how we are and who we are, right? I'll give you an example. I mean, there are of course disasters, but COVID-19 was one of them that really kind of proved what community building and what solidarity really means. I have mostly lived in cities all my life, right, as an indigenous person, and I've seen so many youth from my hometown, villages, etc., move to cities to look for jobs. And when COVID hit, most of them lost their jobs, right? Suddenly. Some of them didn't even have money to pay for rent. And so they found themselves in this situation, which nobody had really imagined, right? And the thing about indigenous communities is that there's always food, there's always a place to come back to. And even if you don't have money, which is obviously, societies, modern societies are centered on, but what beyond money, right? What is the sort of care that you can give beyond money? And that was very clearly evident in the fact that, when the youth started going back to their hometowns, there was food waiting for them. There was a space waiting for them. There was community that was gathering. I mean, I think vaccines came much later. Some of these remote communities were so remote that, the news was coming, possibly very, very delayed to them, and they sort of started mobilizing and taking care of each other. The very sick, for example, and these are part of how we've always lived, right? This is nothing new to us, and that's what we kind of see. Being played out, through the entire cycle of birth, marriages, death. I've seen it in my own family. For example, when my grandmother passed away, she had a funeral, and it wasn't the sort of, the pressure on the family, on the immediate family, to sort of, get this entire, the whole, what do you say, the planning and all of that. It was people coming in, offering food, offering labor. It was always collective. All of that. So I've sort of grown up seeing that. Despite the fact that I've also been, lived in cities and things like that, but whenever I go back, there's always connection, and not extraction. We always say that things for us are not transactional; they're reciprocal. And how is that driven? That's driven through a sense of co-responsibility. I think it's a self-regulating mechanism, right? That you already have the sense of responsibility for each other. So I think that in terms of how we manage climate crisis also is very much a part of our granular existence, our everyday life, and how we respond to it. For example, especially youth. I mean, in these times of disinformation, there's so much that harms people through narratives itself, and that's something that youth have been very very predominantly involved in terms of fact checking, in terms of saying, okay, let's not panic. Let's focus on building adaptive strategies that center us and our needs. Pooling in labor, opening homes. There's always the sort of collective well-being, and women, of course, are very much a part of this sort of backbone of care and responses. And yeah, I mean, I think it's everywhere. It's not just situated in our indigenous knowledge and practices, but also is something that we sort of understand that even with communities that are not indigenous, for example, there has to be solidarity, above and beyond all of that, right? I mean, it's not enough that we count on politicians, on policy to kind of look out for us. That's secondary, in my opinion. I think primarily it's how we mobilize ourselves as community. Yeah, so I think for that, for me, it's that form of sort of care that matters the most. And also in terms of preserving dignity and collective dignity, despite the fact that we live in some of the most militarized zones in the world, possibly. Well,
Thank you, Nina. Thank you for sharing your personal experiences and your stories. And it really shows us that at times of disasters and throughout life, it is very important to nurture not only the physical environment, but also our social environment, our identity, our community. And it's amazing how women, like you said, are a backbone of this act and really solidifying the identity of a community. Thank you for that, Nina. Thank you both for starting us off with such incredible responses. And for us to dive into the conversation further, I would like to ask Ami, reflecting on the recent flash flood in Sumatra that displaced communities and villages, what were the first actions taken by the community, and what do those actions reveal about how people adapt when formal systems fail?
Yeah, so Mel, for the past 2 months, we at Rumah Relawan Remaja has been focused on flood responses and making some psychosocial program supports for the kids and also mothers. And yeah, starting on the third day after the disaster, our team and I started moving along the river to reach some remote communities. And until now, the floods has not yet been declared as a national disaster. That's why many things getting harder in the volunteer side. Yeah. So one experience that I would like to share to you all is from Balingkarang, a remote village in Aceh Tamiang. In this village, a small library run by Rumah Relawan Remaja was completely destroyed by flooding. So every year, people usually evacuate to the village head's house or our library, because these places sit on the higher ground. But this year, the floods were the worst in recent memory. Even that house and our library were swept away along with 55 other families' homes. So the usual places of safety disappear. For 8 days, the village, I mean Balingkarang village, was isolated and received no food assistance from outside. What kept people safe was not formal systems, but local leadership and collective decision making. Um, So in the middle of flood, people decided to move whatever could still be saved, food, supplies, and people. to the village school. They organize themselves, protecting children and elders, and survive together. This reminds me as well of Smong in Simalu, a form of local wisdom that has been passed down orally since the tsunami of 1907 through songs and folk tales, traditional poetic things, and something like that. People learn to recognize natural warning signs of a tsunami. So I also see these folk tales because this is taught from an early age that when the signs appear, they must immediately run to higher ground. So in Balingkarang as well, there is a collective things that is happen passed down regularly. So when they got how to say the rain comes, the people will move fast to the higher places. And today I also see the solidarity, as I mentioned before, solidarity through informal networks, especially among young people across Aceh. As floods impact many areas in Aceh, so youth-led volunteers communities mobilize quickly, very quickly, sharing information, collecting money, and reaching isolated villages when formal aid is delayed. It's actually quite touching conversation because I could see how hard the volunteers work on the ground to support many people who got suffered from this damage. So yeah, so this experiences also sorry, Melanie and others. These experiences shows us that adaptation is not only about infrastructure and technology. It is deeply social and political. It's about whose knowledge is valued, how memory is preserved, and how communities care for one another. If we want just and long-term climate adaptation, we must recognize and support these lived practices.
Thank you
Thank
so
you.
much
Over
for
to you.
sharing that, Ami. Thank you so much for sharing that, Ami. It's really valuable to see um, how local leadership, how local knowledge, community building, community solidarity is really important in adaptation. And like you said, it's not just the wider international policy making that is important when it comes to the long-term climate adaptation, but it's also very much rooted in how local communities and actors respond. So thank you for that, Ami. Thank you for sharing that. For Nina, I would also like to ask you, Indigenous peoples and local communities have long adapted to the climate crisis through collective systems of care, and your work highlights how Indigenous knowledge systems shape responses to the climate crisis. And how do Indigenous communities you work with understand adaptation differently from how it is framed in mainstream policy or development spaces? How do these practices challenge dominant ideas of resilience that focus on individual capacity or market-based solutions?
That's a great question, and one that's often asked in terms of what is it that indigenous bring to the table. Uh, and I think it's important to sort of draw the sort of difference in what indigenous people and who indigenous people are. We're not project managers. I think in the development world, that's something that we often sort of confront, that we're just simply solution providers, right? That they're indigenous people, blah blah blah. We're guardians, we're frontline. We know climate. We know how to manage natural resources, etc., etc. But at the end of the day, we never talk about indigenous people's rights, and looking at our sovereignty as peoples with ancestral territories. And so that brings the sort of larger question, the structural question of the fact that how are we defined within this framework of mainstream policy spaces. For mainstream, adaptation usually means a technical fix. Let's give them some money, let's do some financial, what do you say, inclusion, let's do a project, let's do let's map these outcomes and all of those things. But that's not how life is, right? it has to go beyond what you say infrastructure, good roads, connectivity. That's a very urban sort of definition of what development really is. The way we plan cities, for example, that cannot apply to indigenous communities. There's no sort of smart agriculture. There's no insurance schemes that will, get us out of historical oppression, right? There's no market-based solutions. For example, let's look at, like, for example, projects that look at livelihoods in a very small way, and let's say, okay, like this group of people have had livelihoods given to them, but then what happens after that? We're still very much prone to what's happening in worlds that are far removed from indigenous people's worlds, right? And yet we face the sort of impact of all of that. So I think one is to understand and challenge the whole idea of what development is, and whose solutions are we centering really, and are we showing genuine concern for indigenous peoples and their futures, for example, especially youth. um, and so, you can't provide poor solutions to poor people. That's something that I think all policymakers have to fundamentally understand. I think it needs a lot of empathetic reflection as well. It's not a simple task where it's not a neat beginning and end and middle where you've completed your project and you say, okay, this is what I have to show, for example, my donor. This is what makes sense. And I think also rising above from the comforts of working with the same sort of people over and over again. I think that's one of the biggest challenges that I've seen, having been part of this sort of movement, right? And again, adaptation for us is not just, adjusting individuals to risk. It is not the individual's problem when it is a structural issue that we're all facing, right? It is about how we enable relationships, not just to the ecological aspects of it, but also through, like, again, intergenerational knowledge sharing. There's a lot of colonial aspects to it. I come from a community that does, rotational farming. It was sort of called slash and burn. That's a very colonial sort of term to do it, and the way we define it, which is, again, like when you look at fortress conservation, which is basically the way that that policymakers look at conservation, which I'm sure is being challenged to a certain extent, but it essentially is saying that people are harmful to the environment and animals, for example, and that's something that needs to change as well, right? And so all of these, I think, together, holding space for each other. I think mainstream, I think people from sort of dominant cultures, from dominant communities need to understand that, their allyship and what does that really mean, apart from just being a sort of tokenism, and a tokenistic way of sort of approaching all of these questions, right? And to genuinely, I think, center indigenous people's needs, local communities' needs, and listen and learn and then sort of act. So I think, yes, I think, like I would say again, indigenous people are not project managers. We're not just solution providers. We are sovereign people, with the right to exist and shape our sort of futures the way we want to. Over to you, Belle.
Thank you, Nina, for that answer. Yes, I do agree. I really agree that genuine development and change goes beyond the technical perspective of a project timeline and how much a project would cost and technical aspects like that. But true investment in indigenous peoples and local communities, it goes beyond that. It's a recognition of rights, of sovereignty. You need to empathize with indigenous peoples and local communities and reflect genuinely on what their role is in climate adaptation to be able to work for and with the people. Thank you for that, Nina. And I would like to go back to Ami. I would like to ask you another question. What risks arise when adaptation is treated as an individual responsibility rather than a collective one?
Yeah, in the context of Aceh, like I see from some disasters and these recent floods, So treating adaptation as an individual responsibility will create serious risk, especially when assistance is not distributed evenly. So when floods displace communities, not everyone has the same ability to cope on their own. Some families may have some savings and networks, but some others will not. Do not have stranger houses or access to information. Others lose, yeah, everything at once. When, yeah, and that's I saw from these past 2 months. When adaptation then is framed as something individuals, those who are already vulnerable, such as low-income households, people in remote villages, or women, elders, and people with disabilities, they are left behind. And even aid distribution also exposes another risk, the normalization of survival without support. Communities are prized for being resilient, even when they are forced to survive for days or weeks without adequate assistance. As I gave an example before, from a village called Balingkaran, after 2 weeks, then they got support, they got assistance. This shifts responsibility away from institution and places the burden of adaptation on people who have limited choices. So in Aceh, many communities rely on neighbors, mosques, and informal networks, not because it's ideal, but because formal system arrive late or not at all.
Thank you for that, Ami. Yes, I agree that collective response is really rooted in fair distribution of aid, of resources, and especially solidarity with our community members. Thank you for that, Ami.
Yeah.
And Nina, your work focuses on media and digital advocacy for Indigenous peoples. And in moments of climate crisis, how does control over narrative, visibility, and representation affect who is heard, supported, or sidelined?
Thank you, Belle. Well, I think the fundamental question that one needs to ask is, whose gaze are we writing for, right? Very often in mainstream media, when conversations around indigenous peoples happens, it's usually from a disaster point of view, right? There's only, the way that I've been a part of many newsrooms and the way that stories are decided is predominantly for the mainstream gaze. And media is, again, especially sort of corporate media, is run like any profit oriented business. And so, you know, then what happens is that people's issues sort of take a backseat. What is more sellable, it takes over then. And many editors, unfortunately, even when they are sort of for the people, have to sort of make these compromises editorially. Many times what happens is that mainstream media, for example, will send journalists with very little contextual idea and background and history of the issues, and look at it as a single agenda, like as a single sort of issue, right? Like if there's something happening, if there's a flood happening, they're only going to cover that flood. They're going to ask a few people, maybe a local person who's going to enable their sort of interviews and things like that, and then they come away with very little understanding of a lot of the context that goes behind it, right? And just cover it as a report. So I feel that through my work that we've had a lot of like media fellowships that we've sort of encouraged mainstream editors to work with us, and give Indigenous journalists a space to be able to kind of report on their own stories, on their own communities, with, of course, the principles of journalism in place, and sort of handhold them, and so it's sort of a best of both worlds. It's like looking at allyship with mainstream media as well. And to be able to also not just build capacity, but also be able to, sort of build Indigenous people's understanding itself. Like, it's not easy. It's not enough that just because you're Indigenous, you can go into a community and sort of gain their trust. We've had many times when trust has been sort of abused, right? So it is only natural that indigenous people feel a sense of a trepidation in speaking to even mainstream media. So I think there's a lot of scope for sort of rebuilding, and sort of reconnecting and really looking at what people's stories are like, especially historically oppressed people, looking at it from a decolonized point of view. Especially in moments of climate crisis, narrative really depends, I mean, determines everything, right? Who is believed, who receives support, and who is erased, right? And so, it's not just about visibility, right? Who are we centering, for example? Who are we portraying? Indigenous people are not victims. We're not obstacles to development. And so we have to sort of constantly look back on that lens and see where all of that structural narrative building has come from, right? So we have to look at who sort of the political actors are, what their agendas are. I always tell people, you have to follow the money. Where's the money coming from? Where's the money changing hands? And all of that is intrinsic to how we sort of build narratives around climate justice, for example, and how we also center knowledge holders, decision makers. This obviously again impacts funding, policy responses, general public awareness. Um, a lot of that movement building is through the use of media. Media is intrinsic to movement building. We can't have a bunch of voters who don't understand core issues. Who we ultimately vote for is also depends on how well informed we are, and that can only happen through media and digital advocacy. Again, like I said earlier, build capacity in disinformation and how to tackle disinformation. That's a very big part of our lived reality in the 21st century. It also helps us challenge existing narratives. It also helps us shift power. And when communities tell their own stories in their own languages, in their own frameworks, they challenge many of the disaster narratives that frame climate impacts, right? They also, there's so much conversation on land dispossession, the impacts of militarization, especially on women, youth, extractive projects, things like state neglect. And these are historical issues. I mean, I come from India, and I represent an entire region that was sort of very poorly consulted, if at all, in decision making and policy making, right? Even now we find even researchers coming into the systems, it's mostly extractive. It's mostly what can I get from here and how can I publish this and get my own sort of street cred, out of this work. But it's never really having a sense of responsibility to these communities. And I think uh, also, I think with the media narratives, it's very important also to look at how visibility can also be a double-edged sword, right? Like, I mean, intense scrutiny, it can build intense scrutiny, it can build intense surveillance. We've seen most governments are looking at how to kind of mine data and control populations, for example. And I always tell people, I said, if you aren't aware of what's happening in indigenous communities, and those are the first places that are indicators of what's going to happen to the rest of the population. And so one has to be very clearly aware of what's happening in indigenous communities, not just because you're not just you're indigenous yourself, or just simply because of the fact that this is an almost like a litmus test of what's going to come, if you're not careful, right? And how uh, governments then use indigenous communities and territories to almost act like a testing ground, to see how far they can push their goals and agendas, and predominantly again with extractive industry. And so ultimately, narrative justice is climate justice. And without it, indigenous voices are constantly sidelined, even in conversations about their own lands and their own futures. So I think that's something that we need to consistently monitor and sort of push back against this dominant narrative.
Thank you, Nina, for that answer. Yes. What really struck me the most was what you said about, narrative justice is climate justice and how media plays an important role, not only just a role, but a responsibility to frame climate issues in a different lens, that it's just not a report to be published to build their credentials, but they have the responsibility to really show the systemic factors or the issues why climate disasters happen and what different stakeholders should do to respond to this, and most importantly to emphasize the stories and reflect on the people's lives and how climate affects it. So thank you for sharing that with us, Nina. And to Ami, I would like to know, looking ahead, what lessons from grassroots solidarity should inform future adaptation efforts so that they are more inclusive, gender responsive, and just.
Well, thank you, Ben. Yeah, looking ahead, actually, I found several important lessons from grassroots solidarity in Aceh that should inform future adaptation efforts if we want them to be more inclusive are gender responsive. So first it's about adaptation. So adaptation must be built around collective care that already exists at a community level. As I mentioned before, some example from Aceh, villages in Aceh. Then after floods in areas like Aceh Tamiya, Aceh Utara, and many affected areas, communities did not wait for formal assistances. Most become shelters, neighbors pulled food, and women organized daily survival, cooking, caring for children, elders, and even people with disabilities. So, yeah, these forms of care are often invisible in official responses, yet they are what make survival possible. Future adaptation policies must recognize and support this care work rather than assuming it will continue for free and without support. Yeah. A second, I see that Aceh people. Actually, I'm not originally from Aceh. I've been living here all for almost 9 years. So I see that Aceh people show me the power of local and intergenerational knowledge. In Simelu, as I mentioned before, the tradition of small and who passed down through songs, and this local wisdom can save lives during the 2001 tsunami. So this knowledge taught people, including children, about adaptation, what should be done when there is natural warming signs. So adaptation efforts, must protect and integrate such knowledge instead of replacing it with purely technical system that may fail during crisis. And another lesson that I got is especially about grassroots solidarity. Um, Highlights the importance of the network, especially youth-led initiatives. Many local NGO right now um, started after tsunami, and then I saw also after this recent flood across Aceh, young volunteer initiatives grow up. Yeah, they help many people. They reach remote areas and do whatever they can do with their communities. So supporting youth or young networks like this with flexible funding and decision making power can significantly strengthen the inclusive adaptation, I think. And last but not least, I think Aceh's experience also exposes the gender nature of adaptation. So women carry much of the burden during and after disasters, yet they are rarely included in planning processes. Bell. So after this flood, I could see many women leave the how to say wood left behind by the floods, and the woods are so heavy, but for rebuilding a new shelter for their family, that these women do that. And yeah, so it's hard thing for me actually, but it shows the strength. So yeah, gender responsive adaptation means ensuring women are not only caregivers, but also leaders shaping adaptation priorities and resource distribution. So yeah, in short, Aceh people then teach me that inclusive, gender responsive, and just adaptation is already happening on the ground. The task ahead is to recognize it, resource it, and shift power. So communities are not only responding to crisis, but shaping their futures.
Thank you for extending that lesson to us, Ami. I think it really does show us that grassroots solidarity, as you said, is what makes survival possible. And it shows us also the opportunity to reflect on how resilience is just not enough for us to respond to climate anymore. Also it also requires us to reflect, like, who is formal care responding to, and what does formal response genuinely serve. So it's something that we all need to reflect on and also to act upon. And thank you for showing us how the Aceh community um, has shown answers to that. Thank you, Ami. And to Nina, I would like to know that many current adaptation strategies overlook power and history, but how do colonial legacies and ongoing exclusion shape present day vulnerability for indigenous communities in Northeast India and beyond? And how can adaptation efforts actively confront rather than reproduce these structural inequalities?
Yeah, I mean, speaking of colonial legacies, I think even till this day, we are kind of sort of facing, things that were decided for us, even 70s years ago, when India won its independence from the British. And so we've had a series of colonizations, right? It was, of course, the British who kind of colonized us, but then after that, when the transfer of power began, for us indigenous peoples, we were not consulted even in terms of, how these boundaries were drawn, right? A lot of that decision making happened in New Delhi, which is a centralized form of governance, which is far removed from the lived realities of the people that they're trying to decide for, right? And so that has sort of had a trickle down effect to till this day. And a lot of that, I think, begins with honesty, and understanding where those harms have been located historically, and what are those sort of lasting impacts of the colonial legacies. For us, development is a dirty word. Like I said, again, whose development, whose idea of development is it, right? We've seen a lot of that development take place at the expense of indigenous peoples, at the expense of our rights. It's usually development for an area which is not even geographically close. For example, there'll be mines. The territories will be mined, and all of that outcome and all of that development will take place somewhere else. Even things like ecotourism, for example, in Bangladesh, in the Chittagong Hill tracts. Many of the times there are these, sort of ecotourism projects that promise livelihoods, but in fact, in reality, they bring more harm to indigenous communities, especially indigenous girls and women. We've seen the same thing happen in the south of Thailand as well, where sea indigenous communities are being pushed back into the hinterland, not being allowed to fish, because there are these, five-star resorts that come out. So whose idea of development really is it, is something that I think needs a lot of honest reflection, even from people who want to sort of help. And I think one of the things that must be looked at is also challenging the whole idea of a savior mentality, right? Like, indigenous peoples don't need saviors. We need allies. We need accomplices. And so that's another key aspect of how one, sort of engages with indigenous peoples, for example, and not run the risk of, continuing those colonizations, continuing those sort of colonized ways of looking at things, right? And I think, again, post-colonial development has often, continued this logic through dams, mining, militarization, conservation policies that, of course, again, exclude indigenous peoples from their own land. It's very much ongoing. The agenda is obviously, I mean, you come from the Philippines, Bell. There's such a huge issue of red tagging and criminalization of indigenous activists, frontline defenders. This whole narrative building again, shaping it, um, again, turning people against indigenous peoples through this sort of narrative building, putting them in jails. So all of that, I think, is a colonial legacy, right? And as a risk, and when we remove indigenous people from their communities and from their lands, you essentially are eroding the first line of defense for the rest of us, right? Those of us who are living in cities and perhaps don't see the sort of interconnectedness of somebody living far away from them physically, but still managing those and still holding on to those, those last ways of managing resources and ensuring that there's a sort of challenge to the way that climate adaptation is happening from the mainstream sort of perspective, right? Again, these are systems that have only reproduced inequalities. They've sort of imposed solutions that undermine local control. There's also the question of free, prior, and informed consent, and we know that consent can be manufactured. So I'm going to leave you with a quote, from a very famous Brazilian environmentalist who said that essentially environmentalism without class struggle is just gardening. So one has to look at the politics behind it. One has to follow the money if we are to really, really do something sustainable and impactful in the ways that genuinely have a positive impact on grassroots communities.
Thank you, Nina. I would also just like to echo what you said, that development is dirty work, and who is development truly serving? And what you said about indigenous peoples don't need saviors. Indigenous people and local communities don't need oppressors. We need allies. And also, the quote that you shared is definitely something that will resonate with us as we move towards and as we move for climate adaptation. So thank you for that, Nina. And as we are reaching a conclusion to this thought provoking and reflective conversation, I have one last question for the both of you and also to our audience who are joining us online. So feel free to write in the chat also. So, for both Ami and Nina, from your own experience, what kind of future becomes possible if climate responses are designed to transform unequal systems and not just to withstand their impacts? What shifts in power, in voice, and solidarity are required for that future to emerge?
Yes. Well, I think imagining a transformative climate future would fundamentally again mean looking at vanity metrics. There's a lot of metrics that people use, in terms of how they define change. You have all of these fancy frameworks that are designed by people, in the global north. And so that is, I think, that is the sort of fundamental place, the root of where the inequality is coming from, right? Where people with very little understanding of the ground and the lived realities of people who they're sort of designing these sort of frameworks for, right? Again, it is important to look at societies in the 21st century, which are predominantly money oriented, money sort of promoted. like I always say, if profit was, if, if profit, human rights was profitable, I think everybody would be, a wonderful, advocate of human rights, but unfortunately it isn't, right? And so I think we have to move away from money-centered ways and look at genuinely how we kind of build care. If we are to look at transformative climate futures, what does that care mean? How does that care look for us? It can't be a simple cookie cutter kind of solution that you copy paste. It has to be very much a consultative process, right? With local communities and indigenous peoples. Where care is valued over profit, and ecological responsibility again, over endless growth. You know, the earth is not an infinite source of resources, right? And that's where we find ourselves at this very juncture, where we are sort of having these sort of collective anxieties of what is the future, right? Especially with young people who are unfortunately having to answer all these questions, these really, really heavy questions. And many of you I know are feeling alone. Many of you are feeling, I think, tired. I think that's part of living in a system which constantly aims to extract. We must also fundamentally understand that rest is again resistance, that you can't keep fighting, and so you have to pick your battles. You have to do it very strategically. You can't do it individually. Obviously, you have to go out and find people who have the similar life goals, a similar purpose, and have these conversations. Looking at how you build grassroots democracies. I think there's a lot of space for that to happen at the very granular level, even in cities, even in rural areas. I think that's what young people have to do to kind of say, okay, we're fed up. We need to kind of have our own spaces, decide, how we kind of engage, who we engage with, and sort of build from there, and I think build something that is again rooted in material support and political, similar political vision, and not just symbolism. I think it's very easy. We've seen that with a lot of the women's movement, for example. A lot of that is tokenism, is symbolism. But when it comes to the question of rights, again, that's where we kind of. So I would urge young people to kind of, whichever country you are in, to understand your rights, to understand not just policy, but also legal frameworks. So there's a lot that can happen at the community level, right? That can push forward, and then obviously it results in you voting for better leaders, holding them, holding power accountable. You can't do it unless and until you kind of roll up your sleeves and really get into it, right? So I think that is how we sort of look at a truly sort of transformative climate future.
Thank you for that, Nina. I think, again, just to echo, it's a challenge for everyone, especially the youth, to challenge where systematic inequalities come from and to demand accountability from political actors that um, um, further strengthen the impacts of these inequalities, and for us to understand our rights and our how policies affect us, that, as Nina said, really create a transformative climate future for all of us. And thank you for that, Nina. And uh, Ami, what do you think about this question?
Yeah, thank you, Bill. So in Aceh, I see that the future is like written in water. Aceh people carry the memory of tsunami in people's bones. And today, we still work with communities as flood return season after season. And from my experiences accompanying people who got suffer from the disaster, I learned that climate response cannot stop at building walls against waves. It must transform the ground of inequality that lets disaster strike the same people again and again. So when responses are made to change systems, not only to resist impacts, a new future becomes possible. Village only village sometimes labeled remote because central to recovery. so children can return to books instead of fear, and mothers give not only houses but dignity. For that future to emerge, I think people, power must shift from distant office into village or local one or local communities. Um, yeah, so voice must rise from trauma into decision making. That is something not happening, I think, in Aceh even after 20, more than 20 years of after tsunami. But I see that solidarity must grow from emergency visits into long companionship, working together long after the camera leaves. Yeah, so I see that, and I learned that resilience is not remembering how to endure disaster, but learning how to transform the system. Well, that made some shores more fragile than others.
Thank you for that, Ami. Thank you for that, for sharing your answer. It is truly that climate responses, as you said, cannot stop at building infrastructure. It is really rooted in nurturing the people that are being affected on the ground. So thank you for sharing the stories, Ami, and especially the stories of the Aceh community, and also for Nina for sharing your insights and your experiences. And as we come to the end of this session, I want all of us to take a moment to reflect on what we've explored together. We've heard from Nina and from Ami that transformative climate adaptation is rooted in a lot of factors. It is rooted in accountability from our political actors, from actors that extract and exploit our resources and environment. But as we all have heard from both Ami and Nina, the most important thing to achieve transformative climate adaptation is to nurture, to strengthen the people that are most affected by the climate disasters. So we would also like to hear what you have reflected on from the conversation. So feel free to write them in the chat. And again, thank you so much to our speakers for sharing your insights, experiences, and your grounded wisdom. Thank you to everyone who joined us today, may it be offline or online, and your presence and curiosity are what makes these conversations meaningful. And please stay tuned for the next session of the Community and Action Asia Digital Week, where we'll continue to explore collective futures rooted in care, justice, and regeneration. And in case you'd like to go back to any of the week sessions, all of the recordings will be available online through the link in the video's description. Thank you, and let's keep our hopes rooted in action. Thank you, Nina, and thank you, Ami.
Paano kaya kami magpapakilala? Paano ito simulan? Ang kwento namin, masalimuot. Hindi kayang ipaliwanag sa isang kwentuhan lang. Minsan pa nga, dumarating ang ilang pagkakataon na kami mismo ay nahihiwagaan. Mula sa mga kinagisnan, paniniwala, at hanggang sa pang-araw-araw na ugnayan. Pero nais namin magkaroon ng makabuluhang pagbabahagi sapagkat alam namin kung gaano kahalaga ang aming tradisyon. Mga kabataang dumagat remontado kami na mula sa mahabang kabundukan ng Sierra Madre sa Pilipinas. Kami ang ugbon, mga kabataang inihahanda ng mga pinagmulang komunidad bilang mga susunod na leader. Nakatakda at inaasahang tagapagtanggol ng lupain ninuno at tagapagpadaloy ng mayamang kultura. At kung pagbabatayan sa kasaysayan ng aming komunidad, matatanda ang sentro ng aming balangkas ng pamamahala. Maaari kang maging bahagi ng pagdedesisyon kung napakita mo ang iyong katatagan ng loob at pagiging balanse. Ito ang aming pinigbatayan kung paano namin pinasulpot ang mga advokasya, inisyatiba at panawagan. Napakahalaga ng gabay ng matatanda sa amin at pagtuturo kung paano tumindig. Sa lahat ng ito, mahalagang palagi ang mga ibabang sagradong ugnayan ng katubo at kalikasan At ito ang aming pinanghahawakan hanggang sa kasalukuyan. Marami pa kaming pagdadaanan, lalo na at maraming panganib ang nakaambang pumasok sa aming lupain ninuno. Kabilaan ang mga nagnanais sa akin ito, lalong higit ang napakagandang ugnayan ng bawat isa sa loob ng komunidad. Mga estratehiya ng mga tagalabas upang mapalayas kami sa aming lupang kinagisnan at alisin ang aming karapatan. Lumalala na rin ang pagsubok para sa pagpapatuloy ng aming kultura. Sa mahabang kwentong ito, ramdam namin ang mga kamay na umabot sa amin, tumapik sa aming balikat at sabing tama ang aming ginagawa. Ito ay para sa kapakanan ng lahat. Sumulpot ang maraming pwersa at suporta. Malaking bahagi para sa amin na maging bahagi ng Global Landscapes Forum na mapiling restoration steward ang aming kasama. Malaking plataforma ito para mas mapatunayan pa ang epektibong pamamaraan ng mga katutubo sa pangangalaga ng kabundukan. At dahil sa oportunidad na ito, mas malayo ang aming naabot. Mas lumakas ang aming boses. Mula sa organisasyon ng mga katutubong kabataan sa Sierra Madre, lubos ang aming pasasalamat. Maraming salamat upang gabayan kami upang natural naming maikwento ang aming mayamang pinagmulan. Ito na ang palagi naming magiging paraan ng pagkikwento. Hindi man simula sapagkat nakalampas na, ngunit